Good and evening. My name is Ethan Gelber. I am a co-founder of Outbounding.org, and this is a hangout focusing on how to mend, not end, voluntourism, a continuation of a very involved and knowledgeable discussion that is taking place on Outbounding about how we can change the debate a little bit around voluntourism and move the whole process forward, looking for interesting and important and viable solutions rather than sweeping generalizations about how to end everything. I have four distinguished panelists with me today, hailing from four very distinct locations as well. We'll make the introductions in just a moment. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to go through some background. If you are watching and you hear something that you like and want to comment on, or if you hear something that you have more questions about and want to seek more information, we are using the Q&A app that allows you to ask questions that we will see, or that we will see and do our best to answer. If a lot of questions come in, we will not be able to cover everything live during the Hangout, but if it's a topic of particular interest, we may turn to it and address it in the Outbounding forum. We're using a hashtag with this discussion. It was given to us essentially by one of our Twitter followers. We're using the hashtag #MendNotEnd, hashtag #MendNotEnd. So if you are listening and want to share something via Twitter or Google Plus or Facebook or anything else, please add the #MendNotEnd hashtag so that we can follow it and respond to it. Voluntourism and the different words used to describe it or other things like it is a very complex, very variable topic. If you take a moment to look through the Outbounding discussion about it, and you can look at it, there's a link to it from the Showcase app that is also part of this Hangout. It is also in the description of this Hangout. If you click through to that, you'll see that a great many topics have been brought up, that it covers a lot of ground. It is not specific to animals. It is not specific to working with children in orphanages. It is not specific to disenfranchised people. It is not specific to anything. It is not only about learning, service learning, or universities. It covers a lot of ground, and we will try to cover as much of that ground as possible without getting too focused on one particular topic. This, as an extension of the Outbounding Hangout, of the Outbounding discussion, is also an opportunity to learn which items might be particularly hot and worthy of further discussion, either as a separate thread in Outbounding or as a Hangout, or both. So please let us know if you have particularly strong feelings about that. But please also bear with us as we cover as much ground as possible, and if we choose not to focus in on one issue for the entirety of the chat, that is one of the reasons why. Finally, something that has been discussed and that I want mea culpa on our part. We have four strongly voiced and opinionated people present here today. None of whom works as a receiving organization, as a local host. And it is a voice absent in our discussion on the Outbounding page, but also here in the Hangout. We did try to bring in a number of people who might help to bring in the local perspective, to help share a sense of what is happening on the ground and what it means when we talk theory and they talk practice. Unfortunately, we could not bring them in the time available. There are also some of the problems that are inherent in the process. The local receiving organizations and hosts are busy on the ground doing the things that they have to do on the ground. Many of them don't have the human resource available for it, and in some cases don't have the technical wherewithal to be able to join us in a Hangout like this, at least not in the short term. We will do our absolute best in the future if we pursue any of these topics to try to bring in some of the important local perspectives that will flesh out some of the discussions we have here today. That's the shop talk. Let's move quickly now into the body of the discussion. Four distinguished guests here today: Sallie Grayson, Anna McKeon, Shannon O'Donnell, and Amy Robertson. Let's start from the far left. That would be Shannon. And if you can introduce yourself briefly and let us know a little bit about yourself and your take, not your take, but your experience with voluntourism, why this is of interest to you.
So my name is Shannon O'Donnell, and I got started in the voluntourism industry about 6 years ago. I left on a round-the-world trip, and I had always volunteered back in the United States at the SPCA or local organizations for the homeless, and I knew there had to be a way to do it on my travels in an organic, I wanted to find the opportunities as I went because I wasn't planning any one place that I was going to be, and it was really hard to touch base with a bunch of organizations ahead of time. So over the years, I've become more interested in the independent side of volunteering, of people finding the opportunities directly through the organizations, and that's sort of the approach that I took to start studying some of the issues. And I wrote a book called The Volunteer Traveler's Handbook that helps assess sort of what type of vacation that you're looking for and what type of organization you might need, a placement company to help you, or an independent organization that you can contact through your networks if you've traveled a lot before, and really delves into some of the issues that volunteers should be thinking about. And that's one of my passions, is to help volunteers understand that a lot of the work is on them to start learning the issues, not just the placement companies, but the volunteers have to be invested in becoming educated about everything that happens in this industry. So that's my approach and what sort of brought me here.
Thank you, Shannon. That's great. Much appreciated. Sallie Grayson, Program Director of People and Places. Tell us a little bit more about you and your take on all of this.
Hi, everyone. My name's Sallie Grayson, and I'm co-founder of an organization called People and Places. We are a sending organization. We recruit skilled and experienced volunteers to work with local communities. How did I get to what I'm doing? It's the classic, my experience, and how I learnt how not to do volunteer travel. And I happened to meet a professor of responsible tourism in the Gambia when I was volunteering there, and we felt we wanted to bring about change, and we felt the only way to bring about real change was to do it ourselves and demonstrate best practice. So I guess here I'm representing sending organizations.
That's great. Thank you, Sallie. Thank you very much. Anna McKeon, an independent consultant working on better volunteering practices related to children's care. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your experience in the space?
Hi, Hi everybody. Yes, my name's Anna McKeon. My background with volunteering started about 4 years ago when I left the UK, where I'm from, and went to volunteer in orphanages in Kenya and in Thailand. I then actually moved. I'm now based in Cambodia, and I worked with an organization for a couple of years there, actually managing some volunteers as well. And through that experience in Cambodia, learned to put what happened to me in Kenya and Thailand into some perspective and into some context, and started to learn a lot more about some of the challenges of responsible volunteering. This year I've been working with a group of organizations led by the Better Care Network and Save the Children, who are particularly concerned with how international volunteering is impacting on children in residential care centres. So I've been looking into that issue and talking to people on that issue for the last few months, which has resulted in understanding a great deal more about the complexity of it, the many, many stakeholders involved, and the importance of open collaboration in order to be able to really harness the good intentions of volunteering so that actually positive impact can be achieved. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great, thank you, Anna, and apologies for mispronouncing your last name, McKeon. Take a note. And finally, last but not least, Amy Robertson, who is the author of Moon Travel Guides, Volunteer Vacations in Latin America, and also a contributing editor of Transitions Abroad. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your take on this.
Hi. Well, I have lived for the last 12 years overseas. I'm right now in Lebanon, so please forgive if my internet gets any sketchy at any point. But I've had volunteer vacations myself, or done volunteer projects in Bolivia and Honduras and Lebanon while living there. And I come to the field of travel and travel writing about volunteer opportunities from an educational background of international development and economics. So, I hope that products like this book or that all of these discussions can help guide volunteers towards some better opportunities and help sift through some of the chaff to find the wheat.
Amy, we lost you for a little second there, but I think we got the general gist of things. A little note that this is the power of Hangouts and why we like to use Hangouts. I'm based in New York. Shannon is presently, I believe, in British Columbia. Sallie is, I believe, in France. Anna is in Cambodia, and Amy is in Lebanon. We've got a lot of the world present here today, several continents, for that matter. Let's jump straight into the meat of the issue. I wanted to begin with a nettlesome issue, one that I don't want to get too bogged down in, but that I believe is important, and that has been brought up in the Outbounding forum, and that is the importance of terminology. Even in the introductions, we've heard the word volunteering, responsible volunteering, voluntourism, volunteer vacations. Others often talk about service learning. There are a lot of ways of describing the topic that we're tackling today, and I thought it would be useful to take just a couple of minutes, not too much time, to look at, or at least get one person's take on what the differences might be and how we might work to distinguish between them. I asked Sallie to tackle that issue, so hopefully she's taken a moment and we'll make it all clear for us, her opinion on this matter. Sallie, over to you.
Okay. First of all, I think voluntourism is a phrase that the press and bloggers have adopted to be critical of volunteer travel. But also, I find the phrase voluntourism very difficult because to me it suggests that I want to go and do good and I want to go here, rather than I want to volunteer my skills and where can I go. I think voluntourism is an expression that we need to remove from this debate because it has so many negative connotations, and I think all of us that are here today talking believe that responsible, ethical, and well-managed scenarios can create volunteer travel that is meaningful for communities and the volunteers. So bottom line, voluntourism, negative, selfish, volunteering, positive, and giving.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anyone want to add to that or comment on that? It's a strong take, but a good take.
It reminds me a bit just of the general discussion of a tourist versus a traveler. You know, there's become a lot of negative connotations related to tourism in terms of, you know, just always looking at things through a looking glass rather than experiencing them. So maybe what we need to be is voluntravelers instead of voluntourists.
There's that as well. But rather than, yes, I mean, actually there's, I'm not even going to go there. We don't have time. We have too much other things to discuss. But I think it is an important clarification. And more important, it's valuable to understand that whatever words are being used, It's not necessarily the words that carry the weight, it's the experience. And that is, I think, an important way to shift to the next point. Sallie, in what you said, you brought up the importance of something being meaningful, and that it should be meaningful both to the volunteer and to the locals, that it should be important to host and to visitor. And without wanting to spin things in the wrong direction too much right at the start, I want to share a comment by Vicki Smith, who has also been very active both on the Outbounding forum and in her studies and analyses and learned research into voluntourism. I want to share a quote from her and then basically turn it over to you and see how we can use it as a jumping off point for a discussion of how we can improve processes. This is moving toward the idea of mending rather than ending. Vicki wrote, "The downside is that enough people are not educated in the negative impacts that irresponsible volunteer tourism can have." Not enough people are educated in the negative impacts that irresponsible volunteer tourism can have. There is the absolute assumption that it is all positive. There is the absolute assumption that if intent is good, impact is good. But we know from studies around the world that these absolutes are not true. That is Vicki's thought shared on the Outbounding forum. Now, there are 4 areas of topic that we had proposed we would dip into: responsibility and voluntourism, volunteer skill levels, transparency, and voluntourism with children. I thought this was a nice way of dipping first into the whole responsibility and voluntourism section, looking at how we can get the message out about how volunteering around the world can be beneficial both for volunteers and the communities in which they are working, but that it is also an important responsibility on the volunteer to study more, learn more, research more, read Shannon's book, read Amy's book, read the research being done by Anna and her groups, look into the information that's been gathered by Sallie. So how can we help everyone be better learners before they become better volunteers, and how can we make sure that people aren't underestimating the value of good when they are trying to do good around the world? Big question, big topic. Who wants to go? I'll go for that first. Anna, go for it.
Hi, I'll have a stab at that. I think what the point that Vicki raised is really valid, and it's something that makes these kinds of conversations very tricky, because when you're trying to start a conversation with someone, encouraging them to think about the impact they're having, it can feel very quickly like you're attacking their good intentions, and that you're saying somehow their will to help is wrong. And it's really difficult to navigate those kinds of discussions. And often what I try and do, and what other colleagues of mine try and do, is to sidestep the issue of whether wanting to help is the wrong thing to do, because people often feel like you're criticizing them for even trying. It's trying to separate someone's mission from their method, if you like. So trying to make sure that people really focus on how they're trying to help, rather than why they're trying to help, which is often very personal and very emotional. But to look at instead how you're trying to help, and how that can be improved, and how that can be better informed. And I think there are lots of really great initiatives, both in different volunteer companies, at schools, etc., looking at better preparing volunteers, whether it's cultural orientation, whether it's skills development. And I think there's a responsibility on everybody involved to make sure that they have a strong understanding of what they're entering into. But I think if we can try and separate the idea of the how of this and the methods behind it with the emotional pull to want to support other people, then I think sometimes that makes for an easier conversation.
That's great, Anna. Separating mission from method, separating the how from the why, separating the emotion from the practice. Important, very important details. Anyone else want to share a thought about that? Feel free to jump in. Shannon, your book focuses a lot on this.
Anna said it very well.
Yeah, my book does actually put the onus, a lot of the burden on the volunteer, saying that one, that they do need to analyze their motivations. So much is prevalent about, you know, the Facebook culture is what can I share that makes me look good? And so analyzing that is an important part, I think, of the volunteer's duty in saying, what am I looking to get out of this? And how, because using that as an entry into yourself to saying, so like, how much am I willing to go into this? Because I don't believe that everybody who wants to volunteer should take every vacation to volunteer. And that starts with saying, what am I doing? What's the point of this service? If this service is to be of most use to this important issue to me, well, then maybe I need to wait a year to find, you know, a 2-month block in my work schedule and go, because that might be the best way to help this particular issue. Or there's other opportunities where you can be of service for a week or two. But because there's so many different types of volunteering that can be done, be it with the children and the animals and construction projects, conservation, all of these different things have different needs. So it really, for me, starts with the volunteer dedicating themselves to education, to buying a couple of books and reading up on the issues. And I always sort of like to say that we don't link ourselves with the humanitarian aid industries, but the organizations that we're working with are alongside these industries in these countries. And so not understanding the issues, that there are huge amounts of books written on development practices and best practices, and the United Nations has all sorts of things to say about it. And so starting there and really understanding that you are going to help support and serve a community, but also develop them. That's what a lot of these are doing, is developing the conservation efforts, developing a community's, you know, health infrastructure, something like that. And we are intrinsically linked to that. Can't get that word out. And that it's important for the volunteer to take responsibility for their part in ensuring that they have an ethical code that they can stand by, and that they know enough about the morals and the ethics of this industry that they're not blindly following an organization and their codes.
A lot in there, a whole lot in there. Ethical codes, we might come back to that. Onus of education on the volunteer, but I think we also, there's some responsibility on the receiving organization. We'll try to come back to that. Amy, you come from some development background. Since Shannon brought up the fact that there is an intrinsic link between what happens in volunteers and community development, do you see those connections, and how have you tried to bring those connections to light to the betterment of the overall volunteer space?
I'm sorry, I have to say that I really understand what you just heard.
Sorry, Amy, we're having a little bit of difficulty with your sound. Maybe you didn't hear us, and maybe we didn't hear you. Keep listening in a little bit, and we'll try to come back to you on that. Sallie, you had started weighing in with a thought. Do you want to continue your thought?
I love the comment, method, not mission. I think that's really important. Bravo. And I think we need to understand that most volunteers are on a mission. Those of us that place volunteers and work with volunteers must have a method. And in my experience, most volunteers want to do good, but few of them understand the complexities of the work that's involved. And it's very easy to say volunteers have a responsibility to educate themselves. And by the way, I think they do. But how do we work? So many times I'm here, I know Anna's here, I know many other fantastic, I think Shannon and Amy, it's true too. Our desire to learn how to do better came from our experience of not doing so well. How do we get the first experience for first volunteers to be that little bit better? Why should their experience be any other than ours? Which was, oh yeah, I did that, and now I've learned that I could have done it better. That, to me, is the really big question.
That question having been asked, other than putting forward your life's work is the answer. Is there an answer? It's a question that's been asked, I should say, by one of the people listening in, Frank Seidel, who asks, in reaction to what Shannon has said, who has made the experience that volunteers are willing to put into the research work to researching questions themselves? I believe that means who should be putting the effort into that work. And he writes, in my experience, most of them, especially the younger ones, don't want to invest this time. So is it really just a question of first-time volunteers being lazy or taught that their mission is enough and that the method will sort itself out and they can rely on professionals like you and like host organizations to provide the method? Or is there something else? What is the answer to the question that you've asked? How do we get more people involved in understanding what they have to do? Whether it is insisting that universities teach more about that process, which is something that's been brought up in the Outbounding forum, or if it's making sure that both sending and receiving organizations have the right kind of educational materials in place and make sure that it's part of the process, a more inherent part of the process. What are the steps that need to be taken to make sure that we go in the right direction, given the inherent lack of desire to do so, or at least presented lack of desire to do so?
I do think universities sorry, Anna, no, I'm backing off you. You go.
Okay, I was going to take it a little bit wider. From my personal experience on this, I'm a child of the 80s, and I grew up with Live Aid and Gelber and images of Africa, and I feel that a lot of my attitude to my first volunteering experiences came from just a feeling that I'd grown up with, that I could go and be useful, and that was just how I was brought up. Nobody particularly taught me that, but that was, I think, what I just absorbed from many, many messages about other countries, about development, complicated issues that I didn't really understand, but I just had this feeling that I could go somewhere and I'd probably be okay. And it wasn't necessarily because I think I was lazy. I don't think. It was just that I had that assumption. And I think chatting to a lot of other students, because I do work with development education with students as well, that's also quite a common feeling. And I think definitely having more cultural awareness and cultural understanding and global issues within education systems helps. But I think it's a really big topic. I think this is all about how we talk about development, how we talk about relationships with other countries, how the media is involved, how we think about donating to charities. I think it's all interconnected, and I think hopefully there's coming a time, as we are so much more interconnected now, that these things are going to have to start shifting, and the way that we talk about these problems are going to have to start shifting and going to have to start being more realistic and more appropriate to the new relationships we're developing and to the new ways we're trying to interact and engage with other people from different environments.
That's great. Sallie, you backed off, but now's the chance to jump back in.
No, I don't need to jump back in. I think that I don't think it's just being a child of the 80s. I think we have this big thing in the UK, the civil society. I find students are being encouraged to believe that going to volunteer in a country other than their own will enhance their CV. But that's not only true of students. People in business are given sabbaticals to travel. I think we need to work in the universities and education, and I don't know about the States, but here in the UK, it is getting much better. Universities like LSE and Leeds Met, Manchester Met, Cardiff University, King's College London, those are the ones, in my experience, are working very hard to ask students to think about what their volunteering means, and they're no longer being led to believe that they have the answers, and they are being prepared for a learning experience. I'm not a big fan of the phrase learning service, but I do think that people who want to volunteer and do something, I use this word again, meaningful, or relate to the community, really relate and be of service to the communities they're working with, the first thing they have to do is learn. And they also have to understand, sorry, that's all, I don't mean have to understand. Also, the whole experience becomes so much more worthwhile when they understand that they will learn as much as they share, and it's, now I'm getting very sandals and joystick, but it will, they will learn about a shared humanity.
Okay.
And that's
let me take that concept and move it into another topic area. We can still loop around to it because it's all very related. Frank Seidel, who had the previous comment, also wrote in the Outbounding Hangout, in the Outbounding forum. Frank Seidel runs a German volunteer portal, or works with a German volunteer portal. He wrote the following, which will take us from this importance of the volunteer experience into questions about volunteer skill levels, which is another area that we want to go into. He wrote, "I think that the success of a volunteering program should be measured by the change of the volunteer's attitude toward global challenges, and that it is an error to measure it almost exclusively through the volunteer's work in the host project. But I believe in the impact that a volunteering experience can have on the volunteer's life after returning home, and I am sure that many of the developing countries' problems originate in the industrialized countries, hence the need to be tackled there." In summary, he says, "I am therefore an advocate of unskilled volunteering of young people." Now, in his defense, this is taken a little bit out of context, but I think it is relevant to the importance of, and it's a little bit at odds with some of the other opinions that have been expressed about the importance of making sure that skills are always used in relevant ways, and that skill levels should be assessed and people should be given the right kind of placement. And it also brings in the importance of having local voices, because sometimes the local voices' opinions about skill levels are different from what I've heard from practitioners. But thinking about skill levels, thinking about meaningful contributions, thinking about how, and thinking about where we should place value and how that value can be measured, along with what Frank said about the importance of measuring the volunteer's experience as being primary, or one of the primary issues. Amy, since you have been trying to come in to play, let's see how your connection is doing now.
Okay. Yeah, I can appreciate Frank's point of view. I think from the volunteer's point of view, this is really important, how this can be a life-changing experience and help you to really reflect on some of the injustices that the society you're coming from, if you're coming from a developed country, may have created. But that, to me, doesn't justify the volunteer experience from the hosting point of view. So it also has to be valuable for the host in terms of what's going to happen in that organization with your unskilled labor. And that's it. I think that there are opportunities where it still makes a difference. If you're an unskilled volunteer that's doing a construction project, for example, building a house, there's many NGOs, international and local in Latin America, working on that kind of construction of housing for the marginalized. It's, people talk about, is this taking a job away from a local? In my experience, what I've seen, there's usually, it actually employs a local person that is the oversight person for the construction site that's a professional. That professional gets employed, and maybe one or two local construction workers. And then those volunteers are adding to that. And when those volunteers aren't available, the weeks that there isn't somebody coming in, the work slows down to just what the foreman and his two workers can do. So they are adding to the effort, but not taking away from a local job, and providing still something to the local community, even though their skill set is unskilled.
So I agree with that. I'm not completely against unskilled labor. One of the things that I think we falsely attribute, though, to volunteering is that change that we see in the people who come back fired about issues. And travel in general does that to people, and traveling at the local level, homestays, grassroots level tourism, people who are speaking directly with the locals or learning about issues is what often can cause that same change in people. The first trip anybody has to a developing country, you see them, you send a 19-year-old to India and they come back different with stories. And so there's a shift, I think, that we need to put between, well, we want our youth changed and understanding global issues, therefore they need to go volunteer somewhere so that they understand them. And there is a network of organizations, of social enterprises, people who are related to issues, who have these, maybe longer-term volunteer experiences that don't need unskilled labor, but need tourism, and that we can shift the conversation. I'm really big on saying not every trip is right, and if we, the placement organizations, are willing to tell volunteers, look, like that trip, that dream trip you have where you're spending 5 days doing this and 2 days doing this, and then you want to slip in a volunteer experience, sure, we'll take your money. Or I believe, it's a shift we need to make, and as the industry, as the people sending these, saying, go, have a good time, learn about the issues, you're passionate about this, go investigate it, but maybe don't spend thousands of dollars at these organizations, some of whom aren't doing good projects. They're just there to take your money and have you feel happy on that one day that you're shoving in between everything else. And so I'm really big on saying the change happens through learning, not necessarily through volunteering. I'm a huge fan of volunteering when it fits with your goals, your skills, be them no skills or not, the project you're interested in, and the time frame and all of that, where you're going and what you want to do.
That's great. And another important opinion. Let me just read a couple of comments from the... Sorry, Sally?
May I just say something very quickly here?
Sure.
That Shannon said that was really important. Young people need, because let's be honest, most of the volunteers that are being criticized are probably the young volunteers. Young people need to believe that travel has as much value, if not more, for them than volunteering. That their travel can be worthwhile without the voluntourism unskilled component. And universities and schools are failing young people in that issue at the moment.
I wish we had a university representative here to defend that opinion, and maybe we will be able to bring somebody in. I just want to read 2 comments from the Q&A app because I think they're very relevant. Paul Miedema, Sallie, you know Paul. Can you tell us what he does, just so that we're getting things right?
Paul works in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. He's been working in responsible tourism for 15 years now. Out of his tourism, he works in the townships. Out of his tourism work came his community work. Out of his community work came his volunteer program, where he's one of our local partners. When I first approached him about the volunteer program, he said, no, I don't want to go anywhere near volunteers. It's only bad news.
Okay. Paul's comment on Frank's comment and some of the other things that have been said since is Frank is actually correct. That is about measuring the success of a volunteer placement by the inspiration that comes from it in the volunteer. He writes, Frank is actually correct. A measure of success is seeing people leave our volunteering experiences fired up to challenge injustice based on a deeper understanding of the nature of inequality. In other words, just the travel experience, if I can pull in Shannon's ideas, the travel experience alone with the important volunteering component is in some cases enough to fire up. I want to volunteers are traveling, understanding where it is that they're going, what it is that they're doing, and how it is that they're going to be making a difference, or how they believe they're going to be making a difference. And I'd like to use this to dip into the importance of transparency, which is one of the other topics we wanted to bring up. And maybe turn back to Shannon for a second about codes of conduct, since you were the one who cracked open that Pandora's box, looking at the relationship between volunteer placement companies and their projects. Do they vet volunteers for the skills that they have and might bring to a project? And have they built the project and have the placing organizations worked with local communities in long enough to be able to understand what they're bringing to them? Shannon?
So, sorry, I had dropped off there for a little bit of what you were saying. My internet froze, but
okay.
On the codes of conduct, I think in our outbounding discussion, there was a lot about just how many different codes of conduct there are and everything. And that was one of the things I wanted to say earlier, partly when we were talking about these, really eager young volunteers who, some are saying aren't interested in learning about the issues. And I contend that while there is a large percentage who aren't, the ones who are still are just overwhelmed by how much information is out there, with as much publicity as some of the really negative stories have gotten, the little white girl and boy story, white savior complex, all of these terms that are being thrown around by different websites. There is a consciousness growing, and when they go look for information, they find those, and then they're not sure. And then we present them with a really scattered amount of organizations. There's no one term. So I get a lot of emails asking me, well, Shannon, I don't want to do independent volunteering, which is what I advocate, and totally okay, because I say it's a lot harder and you have to be willing to support yourself on the ground a lot more. So what organizations can I use? And the landscape changes so quickly, and there are dozens of different codes and people operating to different standards that it's really difficult from the volunteer perspective of knowing how they're actually working with communities on the ground. And that's why I've always said put the onus on the volunteer of questioning, like, how long have you worked with these projects, and what is your relationship? If all the volunteer funds dry up tomorrow, are you still invested in that community, or are you there for the money? Like, do you leave that community and whatever that long-term goal was? The Peace Corps say what you will, and there's lots of people who say negative things about them, they have long-term investments in these communities. The projects go on for years, decades, you know, be that good or bad, but they are there. And a lot of volunteer projects, some of the things I've seen when on my travels are half-finished playgrounds because they just decided to abandon the project. So you've got a school with a yard dug up and half of a playground equipment, but then the project didn't have enough volunteers to finish funding it and aren't doing it. The organizations can claim anything they want. We don't have enough standards across the board to know who's adhering to what. Maybe that's me.
All right, thanks. Anna, you haven't had a voice in here for a little bit. Do you have? I know there's a lot in the mix right now. Is there anything you want to tackle?
I actually think Sallie would probably be a good person to chat about whether she feels standards across the board would be useful. We briefly talked about similar things on the outbounding discussion because there's so many different types and styles of volunteering. It's really difficult to regulate as an industry. And I think, totally agreeing with Shannon, that's why the onus is so much on the volunteer to really understand what questions to ask and what appropriate answers are to those questions as well. Linking back to what you were saying before, I also think that the onus on the volunteer once they return, this idea that they return from an experience fired up to create change. I think that often does happen, but also I think there's still something missing where there's support for people to understand how what they experienced in another country relates to their choices back at home. That can be really difficult to unpick. And I think if there was a little bit more informational support with volunteers helping them do that, there's a great organisation in Ireland called Colov who do work a little bit like that. But there aren't many organisations doing that, and I think there's room there to support volunteers more in that way. I also want to say one totally unrelated thing. The mission methodology comment I mentioned before, I really should attribute that to somebody I spoke to and worked with at an organisation called Connected, who do amazing work with church group organisations all around Asia. And she was the first person to introduce me to this idea of separating mission from methodology. So I don't want to claim that one as my own, Sallie.
Well, thanks for that. I just want to read a comment from one of the people listening, Alistair McKenzie, a well-established travel guy who's chiming in here as a proud dad. He writes that this summer my 18-year-old son took himself off to Kenya to work with orphaned kids. Before and after, when I have suggested voluntourism programs with travel companies, he just turns up his nose at it and says, "I'm not going on holiday, Dad." A lot wrapped up in that. But I would like to use it, and he adds here a continuation of what he asked before. Does voluntourism devalue volunteering? In other words, his son has taken it upon himself to volunteer, but he doesn't want to work through a voluntourism organization. I also want to use this as a means of jumping into the final topic because we're beginning to run out of time. I'm kind of glad that we saved it for the end because it is a very meaty and contentious issue, but I don't want to leave it out entirely, and that is voluntourism or volunteering with children. The whole question of whether or not skilled or unskilled, in orphanages or not in orphanages, there is any place for travelers to work with children in places where they might not have been working with children at home. By which I mean that people who don't work with children in their home countries, should there be any reason for them to work with children in other countries, and whether or not they should do it in orphanages and all the rest of that. That is a very meaty issue to unpack, and I thank Alistair for allowing us to move into that just for a moment. Anna, that is more your area than anyone, so maybe back to you, and then we'll get other people's opinions on it.
Sure. Just which part of that do you want me to answer? I think volunteering with children, I think one thing you mentioned is critical, and it applies to other types of volunteering as well. But if if it's something you wouldn't be allowed to do in your home country, then you need to question whether or not you should be doing it in another country. And I speak from experience in this, having not done it. As Sallie said, probably a lot of us have been in places, had experiences where we've done it the wrong way first and learnt that way. It's also very, volunteering with children can often be very difficult to understand from a volunteer's perspective, because when you're working with children, often they're giving you lots of affection, lots of love, and lots of positive feedback, and it's very difficult to see why that could be in any way harmful on a short-term basis when you're in that scenario. And unless you've got the time and the understanding and the connections and the resources to really unpack who these kids are, why they're there, what the situation is, what your interaction can create, then it's very understandable why volunteers come in and out of these situations and don't really know or understand how or why they might be creating harm or why there might be problems there. So yeah, it's a really complex issue, but I think as a rule of thumb, looking at whether you or not you'd be allowed to do it in your home country and the reasons as to why and why not gives good guidance as to whether or not you should be looking at those opportunities elsewhere.
I agree with that. I would also say that the skills you have or your ability, like maybe you don't work with children now, is sort of inversely, it changes over time. So if you have a week to give and you're looking to do something and you want to volunteer but you have no experience with children, then maybe don't. But as you move up into the, well, now I'm looking to go somewhere for 2 months, 6 months, a year, those are just like in your home country, you can learn that job. Like a year commitment to an orphanage is solid. That's something that they could use, they could likely use your skills, you know, that'd be a conversation between you and them. But just as you could learn, you know, I could apply at one of the at-risk centers here in my hometown, and given a year commitment, they would take me. So thinking of it like that is just as well. Time saves some of the issues in volunteering. The longer commitments you have, I think, sort of take away some of these issues. A lot of the problems we've discussed, I think, on the call have to do with some of the much shorter term placements, people coming in for really brief periods of time and dropping in for the volunteering.
So does that go to the heart of this difference between voluntourism, devaluing volunteering? Because what it sounds like you're describing, Shannon, is volunteering, whereas voluntourism is shorter-term placements in the context of travel.
Yes, yeah, that's a good distinction. I wouldn't have said it like that, but I like it, and I do still support voluntourism. You know, I have done shorter-term opportunities. There are things, but that's where knowing the issues and knowing where one voluntourism experience fits and maybe doesn't, the children thing being a contentious topic for a one-day drop-in, whereas other projects are completely okay with that.
Thanks.
May I just say, to build on Anna's comment with children, if you're not allowed to work with children in your own country, question whether you can work with them in any other country. Back to Paul Miazima, who I think is the one local voice we've had, he stood passionately at a presentation a couple of years ago and said, why do you people think just because we are poor, we can be your playthings? And I think that's something we need to remember. So it isn't just about working with children. It's anything. End of.
I think that goes to the heart of another comment that was here. Let me just select it, where Frank Seidel also added, reacting to what Anna says, I agree that almost all volunteer sending organizations can and must be much better at helping volunteers learn, which is why the focus should shift to this matter. In other words, sending organizations have to be aware of the work of what they're doing. They have to be aware of the local perspective and make sure that they're making the right choices, but also sending the right people and aware of the local perspective on the matter.
Some of the really interesting models of volunteering and even voluntourism, shorter-term trips, if that's how we're going to distinguish the two, that I've seen are much more exchange-based, where you take out this idea of one person going to help another person, and instead you introduce the concept of two people coming together in a community, one person with an outside perspective and one person with an inside perspective, to solve a certain social problem, and then working together to whatever it is to do, to launch a campaign, to raise awareness. And those models I find really interesting, where it's taking out this idea of the have-nots, the helping, the idea that if you have money to go and work for free, then there's immediately a power imbalance between the person going to volunteer and the person receiving the help. So instead of looking at it like that, looking at it as coming together in an exchange and then a learning from each other of all these different perspectives and the different things that you can bring together to solve a social problem in a community, which you can probably also then take back, the person who traveled can take back and apply those lessons at home as well.
That's great. We have 4 minutes left, and one question that I'd like to use, which was the very first question that was asked, I'd like to use as a means of getting your last word on things, try to round things out a little bit, and this also responds to Matt Barker's desire to know what's next, what do the panelists think are the prospects for actually shifting attitudes, and how do we do that. I want to come to Scott Prolinsky's question, and this was the very first question. He asked, what is the main complaint of bloggers and writers who are attacking the voluntourism industry, and how can we effectively help educate people? So your last word being, what is the complaint, and how can we then move beyond the focus on that complaint to productive engagement or understanding, bringing in some of the issues that you may already have brought in, or bringing in anything else that you'd like to share at this during these last couple of minutes. How can we, are the complaints on target? If they are, how can we answer them? And if they're not on target, then how can we get rid of those off-target complaints and start focusing on productive engagement and productive change, mending, not ending. Amy, you haven't spoken in a little bit. Let's get back to you.
Sure. I mean, I think some of the complaints are on target, and that's why they're out there, because there are volunteers who have gone out with the white savior complex. There are local organizations that are corrupt. And it's just unfortunate because, in my opinion, this is the small minority of experiences. And unfortunately, all the great work being done by volunteers, by hosting organizations, by sending organizations, it just doesn't grab headlines in the same way. But the second part of the question ties in my opinion, with Matthew's question about what can we do next. And like Sallie mentioned, a lot of the headline-grabbing negative experiences from the point of view of volunteers are young people with the best of intentions that weren't really prepared or pointed in the correct direction in terms of. This is what I've been, thinking about a lot since our outbounding discussion. We're here talking with people that are very interested in the subject, and people who sit down to read through that outbounding discussion or to watch this video are people that are already committed to really delving deeper. And how can we reach out to everybody else out there that maybe doesn't even know that it's a topic to explore? And been trying to think, is there a way for us sort of that are passionate about the subject to come together and communicate this better with information that goes out to universities, something that's a bit more of a bullet point, kind of small, easy to digest way of getting where are resources that people at universities can go to, where are resources that youth groups can go to, something to get people pointed in the right direction, while those of us that are working more deeply on the subject dig deeper. I'd like to know what the other panelists, what ideas they might have also.
Thanks, Amy. Sallie?
I think universities is one place to start. I also think, and I start by saying mea culpa here, that those of us that are campaigning for change need to offer attractive alternatives, because people are always going to want to volunteer, to travel, to give, whether we believe they're doing it for the correct reasons or not. And I have spent years shouting about what's wrong with the industry. I now have to take responsibility for demonstrating how we can do it better. We started People and Places not because I thought, oh, it'd be a great idea to start a volunteer organisation. We started what People and Places to campaign for change, to prove that it can be done responsibly. And we're starting to work with university groups now. We found that really difficult, but we're doing it. So now I need to demonstrate how we're doing that and how it can be done properly.
Thanks, Sallie. Anna?
Sorry. Yeah, I think to answer the two-point question, in terms of the complaints of bloggers and writers, from the angle I'm coming from, which has been looking at the impact on vulnerable children, I think the complaints are relatively well placed in that people are worried that harm is being caused. And I've witnessed that myself in the countries that I've lived in, and I think there is a problem in terms of how we address some of those really critical issues that where people are being exploited, where there are problems with dependencies. So I think there are legitimate complaints. However, I also think I agree with all the other panelists that there's also bashing the industry and consistently focusing on the negative isn't representative either, and it isn't necessarily helpful in harnessing the good that that can be done to create positive impact. I think what's really tricky to do is to reach those who don't want to be reached. Because if you're making things like ideas and questions and bullet points accessible to people, they need to want to go to those in order to read them. So how can we look at things like image campaigns on Facebook and Instagram that that represent like responsible, fun, still cool travel experiences and volunteer experiences? How can we shift how things are perceived on social media? I think that's one of the key ways, and then combine that with maybe other more engaged and strategic initiatives at university level. But I think a lot of how people perceive what they're doing and how they're traveling and how they're helping at the moment is being shared through social media. And so I think if we can try and role model better practice in that, maybe even just by encouraging people that we know to start doing it, you might begin to see a shift in terms of how people think about what they're doing and representing what they're doing and what that means.
Thanks, Anna. And to Shannon, last word.
Yeah, one of the things I really like that Sallie said is pointing them somewhere. And we're not going to end the want to volunteer, that sort of the people who have that desire. And one of the things that the attacking, that the blogging and the articles do is they simply attack, and so it puts up a wall that people who need to hear the message then say, well, that's not me. I'm not going to listen to this because it's attacking a really deeply held belief I have about myself, that I'm fundamentally a good person, and wanting to help isn't a bad thing. So when we attack them, we're not getting any messages across to some of this. And so moving forward, it's about sort of redirecting. It's what a lot of the work that I've been doing in this space has been, is saying not every trip is great. The desire to serve, I like to use the word be of service, the desire to be of service is valuable, but sometimes we can channel that in other places, and that's where my Grassroots Volunteering Social Enterprise database came about, was saying we have to be pointing these people somewhere. If you're telling them that your organization can't help them with this particular trip, then where are the resources that are saying there can still be trips that are of service that are not volunteer or voluntourism trips? And really reframing the conversation of how we're including all of the travel experiences and different types of travel experiences into our world of volunteering, so that we're able to have people still satisfy that desire inside of themselves. But that takes a shift in conversation and of tone of how all of our websites are talking about the industry. Instead of that, well, we're here to meet your needs, it's that we're here to meet the needs of everybody, of all the different angles, and there is a fit for you, but you have to search for it. Instead of go search through my database and find exactly what you want, and if not, call, and we're going to find you exactly the right fit inside of some sort of volunteer experience that fits with the concept of what you have. It's about really showing that the industry is malleable and that we are willing to include a lot of different things inside of volunteering.
Thank you. Thank you, all four of you. Let me add one other element. I have been working with all four of the panelists here, as well as probably a dozen or more other people, on an e-publication called, well, tentatively called Beyond Voluntourism, which is, the intent of which is to look exactly at this, to demonstrate where the industry is today, to create to share the kinds of questions that people can and should ask, and to provide perspective on the kinds of opportunities that are out there in a very, very flexible way. So look for all of their contributions, as well as others, in a forthcoming publication, in addition to all of the excellent work that is being done by all four of the panelists here. So thank you, Sallie, Anna, Shannon, and Amy, for your contributions. I hope you will continue to stay engaged on the Outbounding forum. We will now look at how we can slice and dice that a little bit, or at least focus it in different ways. At over 25,000 words, it is a rather consequential resource that needs to be parsed in ways that make it easier for others to enjoy, and, for example, shared on social media, and to everyone's benefit. We're about 7 minutes over. I don't want to hold our viewers any longer, and I don't want to hold the four of you. But again, thank you so very much for your time, for your interest, for your expertise, for your knowledge, and for your passion. We look forward to carrying on the conversation here and in other places.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.